A high-stakes confrontation is unfolding on the open seas. Reuters reports that the New York Times says Russia sent a formal request urging the U.S. to halt the chase of an oil tanker now fleeing the U.S. Coast Guard in the Atlantic Ocean. Those reports say Russia delivered a diplomatic note to U.S. officials, including the State Department, as the clock ticked toward midnight on New Year's Eve. At the center of this unfolding standoff, a tanker known as Bella 1. U.S. officials and multiple outlets describe a pursuit that has lasted roughly 2 weeks. International reporting describes the tanker as Iran-linked and Venezuela-bound, though the full route can't be independently confirmed. This confrontation represents a significant escalation in the ongoing tensions between the United States and both Venezuela and Russia. The outcome of this standoff could set precedents for sanctions enforcement and international maritime law for years to come. Reports placed the start of the chase in late December, and according to reports, the U.S. Coast Guard attempted to board the tanker in the Caribbean Sea as it was heading toward Venezuela. U.S. authorities say it lacked valid flag status, which they argue can allow boarding under international law. They also say they hold a seizure warrant issued by a U.S. court. But the crew refused to comply with the Coast Guard's orders. Instead of stopping, the Bella 1 turned away and fleeing back toward the open Atlantic, according to reports. The U.S. Coast Guard has reportedly been trailing the tanker from about half a mile behind as it sails in the open Atlantic Ocean away from Venezuela. This pursuit has continued for roughly 2 weeks, an unusually long maritime chase that has drawn international attention. The crew's refusal to submit to boarding has forced U.S. authorities to consider their options carefully. The legal justification for the attempted boarding centers on the vessel's flag status. Under international maritime law, ships are required to sail under the flag of a recognized nation. This flag determines which country has jurisdiction over the vessel. U.S. authorities say it lacked valid flag status, which they argue can allow boarding under international law. Legal analysts say ships without valid registration may lose key protections, and states often treat that as grounds to board. Some tracking data cited in reports suggested unclear registry details at the time of the attempted boarding. The vessel had reportedly been flying under the flag of Guyana, but U.S. officials say that registration was not valid. This distinction between valid and invalid flag status is crucial to understanding the legal framework of the dispute. If the vessel was truly stateless, the U.S. would have stronger legal grounds for boarding. If it had valid flag status, the situation becomes more complicated. Then came a bold and unexpected move. In the days following the attempted boarding, the tanker began claiming Russian protection, according to reports. A U.S. official cited by major outlets says the crew appeared to paint a Russian flag on the hull of the ship. U.S. officials describe it as an attempt to complicate or deter a possible seizure. The U.S. Coast Guard reportedly spotted the insignia on the aging and rusted oil ship during the ongoing pursuit. Over radio, the crew told the Coast Guard they were now sailing under Russian authority, according to reports. By claiming Russian status, the legalities of seizing the vessel could become more complicated, reports indicate. This tactic, painting a flag on the hull mid-pursuit, is unusual and raises questions about its legal validity. The crew's action suggests they understood the potential protection that Russian flag status could provide. Soon after the flag was painted, the vessel's official status changed. Reports say the ship later appeared in Russia's maritime registry under a new name, Marinera, with a listed home port of Sochi on the Black Sea. Analysts say the sudden registry change could be aimed at gaining political or legal cover from seizure. However, legal experts quoted in major reporting say securing Russian protection may be a long shot for the vessel. Experts say the rapid registration change may not provide solid legal cover, particularly since U.S. authorities claim the ship lacked valid flag status when the pursuit began. Maritime lawyers say flag changes mid-incident are often disputed and may not settle the enforcement question. The speed of the registration, apparently completed within days during an active pursuit, has drawn skepticism from legal analysts. Whether this registration will hold up under international scrutiny remains to be seen. Now, Moscow has formally stepped into the dispute. Reuters reports that the New York Times says Russia sent a formal request urging the U.S. to halt the chase. Those reports say Russia delivered a diplomatic note to U.S. officials, including the State Department. Moscow is framing the case as defense of a vessel now under Russian flag. Washington, however, insists that when the boarding was attempted, the ship lacked valid flag status and was covered by a judicial seizure order for violating sanctions. By registering the ship, Russia may be trying to raise the diplomatic cost of any boarding, according to analysts. This diplomatic intervention transforms what was a U.S.-Venezuela dispute into a potential U.S.-Russia confrontation. The stakes have risen significantly with Moscow's involvement. Legal experts are debating whether Russia's intervention changes the legal landscape. Maritime lawyers say flag changes mid-incident are often disputed and may not settle the enforcement question. Legal analysts say ships without valid registration may lose key protections, and states often treat that as grounds to board. However, Russia's diplomatic intervention raises the political cost for Washington significantly. The case has now moved beyond a U.S.-Venezuela dispute into the realm of U.S.-Russia relations. Any attempt to forcibly board a vessel now claiming Russian flag could be framed by Moscow as a provocation against Russia itself. This creates a diplomatic dilemma for the United States, balancing sanctions enforcement against the risk of escalation with a major power. The legal ambiguity may ultimately matter less than the political calculations on both sides. The pursuit of the Bella One is part of a broader U.S. pressure campaign against Venezuela. Trump announced what he called a total and complete blockade targeting sanctioned tankers linked to Venezuela. The stated goal is to squeeze Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's main economic lifeline, oil exports. Venezuela's oil exports, mainly to China, have kept the country's economy afloat despite years of U.S. sanctions. The Trump administration believes that cutting off oil revenue is the best path to pressuring Maduro, though critics question whether the strategy will achieve its stated goals. This blockade represents a significant escalation in U.S. policy toward Venezuela. Previous administrations imposed sanctions but did not attempt this level of direct interdiction of oil shipments. The approach carries both opportunities and risks for U.S. foreign policy in the region. The Bella One is not the first vessel targeted under this policy. Reuters and other reporting say the U.S. seized at least one tanker near Venezuela and later intercepted another. One seized ship was later reported near Texas, according to reports. A tanker called Skipper, sanctioned by the U.S. for ties to Iran, was among those seized, according to reports. U.S. officials have said they plan to seize more ships as part of the blockade policy. These vessels are accused of being part of what analysts call a shadow fleet, ships operating with flags of convenience and shell companies to move sanctioned oil. The pattern of seizures demonstrates the administration's commitment to the blockade. However, the Bella One's resistance, and now Russia's intervention, shows the limitations of this approach. The Bella One is described by U.S. officials as part of a broader network of sanctions-evading vessels. Analysts say a shadow fleet or dark fleet operates to move oil from sanctioned countries, including Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, while evading international restrictions. These vessels often use flags of convenience, registrations in countries like Panama, Hong Kong, or Guinea, and operate through shell companies that make ownership difficult to trace. The U.S. Treasury said it sanctioned 4 firms tied to Venezuela's oil sector and listed 4 tankers as blocked property. Those tankers were reportedly flying Hong Kong, Guinea, and Panama flags and are accused of financing the Maduro regime. Some analysts argue Russia's registries could be used to complicate enforcement, but the scale of that trend is debated. The shadow fleet has evolved sophisticated techniques to avoid detection, turning off transponders, conducting ship-to-ship transfers, and frequently changing names and flags. The Bella One's mid-pursuit registration change fits this pattern of evasion. The blockade is backed by significant military assets. U.S. Southern Command says about 15,000 personnel are operating in the area. Reports show U.S. aircraft deployments to Puerto Rico, including F-35s, as the buildup expands. U.S. officials and media reporting describe a surge in interdictions and strikes, though totals vary by account. This military buildup underscores the administration's commitment to the blockade and the potential for confrontation. The deployment of advanced aircraft like F-35s signals that the U.S. is prepared for various scenarios. This level of military presence in the Caribbean is unusual outside of major exercises or crises. The buildup sends a message to both Venezuela and its allies about U.S. resolve. Venezuela has responded to the blockade with defiance and strong rhetoric. Caracas has denounced the blockade as an act of naval piracy and an undeclared war against its economy, according to reports. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez accused the U.S. of imperial threats. "We stood our ground against them with unwavering determination," Padrino Lopez said, according to reports. "We have not succumbed to the temptations of imperialism." Venezuela has announced that its navy will accompany some tankers leaving the country. Officials have reportedly discussed putting troops on board tankers, a move that would significantly heighten the chances of an armed confrontation with U.S. forces on the high seas. This threat of military escort raises the stakes considerably. Any incident involving Venezuelan military personnel could escalate rapidly. Russia has signaled its strong backing for Venezuela throughout this crisis. In a recent call between the foreign ministers of Venezuela and Russia, Moscow reaffirmed its all-out support and solidarity with the leaders and people of Venezuela, according to a summary from Russia's foreign ministry. This support extends beyond diplomatic statements. By registering the ship, Russia may be trying to raise the diplomatic cost of any boarding, according to analysts. The move aligns Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, all countries under U.S. sanctions, in a shared effort to circumvent American economic pressure. This alignment represents a challenge to U.S. sanctions policy globally. If these countries can successfully protect each other's vessels, the effectiveness of maritime sanctions could be undermined. International reporting describes the tanker as Iran-linked. U.S. officials and international reporting describe the tanker as Iran-linked and tied to sanctioned oil flows, but the exact cargo claims are disputed. Iran has maintained a flow of ships that help sustain Venezuela's refining and oil trade despite sanctions. This cooperation between Tehran and Caracas has frustrated U.S. efforts to isolate both countries economically. The U.S. Treasury has sanctioned the tanker over alleged sanctions evasion activity tied to Iran-linked networks. By intercepting such vessels, Washington aims to disrupt the financial lifeline connecting sanctioned states. The Iran-Venezuela oil relationship has deepened in recent years as both countries face U.S. pressure. This network represents a significant challenge to U.S. sanctions enforcement. The timing of this standoff is particularly significant for U.S. foreign policy. All of this comes as U.S. President Donald Trump is trying and struggling to negotiate a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, according to reports. The president has repeatedly voiced frustration over his inability to bring the war to an end. A direct confrontation with Russia over a tanker could complicate those diplomatic efforts significantly. Any attempt to forcibly board the Bella 1/Marinera now could be presented by Moscow as a provocation against Russia. At the same time, if Trump backs down, it could appear that he's yielding to Russian protection, potentially undermining his own sanctions policy. This creates a difficult balancing act for the administration. The tanker dispute has become intertwined with much larger geopolitical considerations. The administration faces a genuine dilemma with no easy solutions. Enforcing the blockade means potentially escalating tensions with Russia at a moment when Trump is seeking cooperation on Ukraine. Backing off could be seen as weakness, allowing Russia to provide cover for sanctions evasion. The tanker dispute threatens to inject new tension into U.S.-Russia relations beyond the Ukraine conflict. For Moscow, the intervention may serve multiple purposes: supporting an ally in Venezuela, challenging U.S. sanctions authority, and testing Washington's resolve. This is a test of U.S. credibility on multiple fronts. How the administration responds will be watched closely by allies and adversaries alike. U.S. military options are being carefully considered. U.S. officials say enforcement decisions depend on legal process and operational approval, but details haven't been publicly confirmed. Such an operation would require a maritime special response team, personnel with experience in boarding vessels that do not submit to seizure. A forced boarding is considered dangerous and could escalate quickly, officials and analysts warn. The media and diplomatic fallout from such an incident would be significant, particularly with the vessel now claiming Russian flag status. The administration must weigh the benefits of enforcement against the risks of escalation. This is not a decision to be taken lightly. International maritime law is central to this dispute and its potential resolution. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, vessels have the nationality of the state whose flag they fly. Flag states have jurisdiction over their vessels, and boarding a flag ship without permission can constitute a violation of that state's sovereignty. However, legal analysts say ships without valid registration may lose key protections, and states often treat that as grounds to board. The key legal question: did the Bella One lack valid flag status when the U.S. attempted to board it? U.S. officials say yes. Russia now claims the vessel is under its flag. Maritime lawyers say flag changes mid-incident are often disputed and may not settle the enforcement question. This legal ambiguity creates uncertainty for all parties involved. This is not the first time tankers have become flashpoints in international relations. In 2019, Iran seized a British flag tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, triggering an international incident that raised tensions across the region. The U.S. has previously seized Iranian tankers carrying sanctioned oil in various operations. These confrontations demonstrate how oil tankers can become symbols of broader geopolitical disputes. The Bella One case adds a new dimension, that with a vessel attempting to change its flag status mid-pursuit to escape seizure. Whether this tactic succeeds could set a precedent for future sanctions enforcement worldwide. If it works, other sanctioned vessels may attempt similar maneuvers. Understanding the Dark Fleet helps explain the stakes of this confrontation. These vessels operate in the shadows of international shipping, using techniques to avoid detection and seizure. Common tactics include turning off tracking transponders, transferring cargo at sea between ships, using shell companies to obscure ownership, and frequently changing flags and names. The rapid registration change of the Bella One to Marinera under Russian flag fits this pattern of evasion. By constantly shifting identity, these vessels make enforcement extremely difficult. The U.S. blockade is an attempt to directly counter these evasion tactics, but the Bella One case shows the limitations of this approach. When major powers provide protection, enforcement becomes even more challenging. Venezuela's economy depends heavily on oil exports. The country possesses some of the largest oil reserves in the world, but years of mismanagement and sanctions have crippled production. Oil exports, mainly to China, remain the government's primary source of revenue. By blocking these exports, the U.S. aims to deprive the Maduro government of resources. For Caracas, this is an existential threat, not just to the government, but to the population that depends on imported goods purchased with oil revenue. The human impact of the blockade is significant, though the political impact on Maduro's grip on power remains uncertain. Venezuela's people suffer regardless of the outcome. China is Venezuela's primary oil customer and a crucial partner for Caracas. Despite U.S. sanctions, Chinese companies have continued purchasing Venezuelan crude, though often through intermediaries and the shadow fleet. There has been no publicly reported on-the-record response from China in major international coverage so far regarding this specific standoff. However, China has consistently opposed U.S. sanctions as extraterritorial overreach, applying American law beyond U.S. borders. The U.S. blockade of Venezuelan oil tankers affects Chinese energy supplies, potentially adding another dimension to U.S.-China tensions. This could become another friction point in the already complicated U.S.-China relationship. The Caribbean has become an unexpected zone of confrontation. U.S. military operations in the region have increased significantly under the blockade policy. Venezuela has responded by deploying naval assets and threatening to put troops on tankers. Small Caribbean nations are caught in the middle. Their waters now the site of enforcement actions and potential confrontations. The militarization of oil enforcement raises concerns about stability in a region historically marked by relatively peaceful maritime activity. These nations have limited ability to influence the outcome, but face potential consequences. Both sides are framing the dispute to their advantage in public communications. Washington presents the blockade as counter-narcotics enforcement and sanctions implementation, targeting criminal networks and authoritarian regimes. Caracas frames it as piracy and imperial aggression. an attempt to steal Venezuelan resources and overthrow a sovereign government. Moscow positions itself as defending international law and supporting an ally against American overreach. These competing narratives will shape how the international community responds and whether other nations take sides. The information battle is as important as the physical confrontation. Several scenarios are possible as this standoff continues. The U.S. could order a forced boarding, risking a confrontation with a vessel claiming Russian flag and potentially complicating relations with Moscow. The U.S. could continue the pursuit indefinitely, trailing the vessel while seeking diplomatic or legal resolution. The tanker could attempt to reach a friendly port, possibly in Russia, Venezuela, or another country willing to harbor it. Russia could escalate, perhaps sending naval assets to escort the vessel, or a diplomatic solution could emerge, with back-channel negotiations resolving the standoff. Each scenario carries significant risks and implications for all parties involved. A forced boarding would carry substantial operational risks. The vessel has been fleeing for roughly 2 weeks, demonstrating the crew's determination not to submit. Boarding a resisting vessel requires specialized personnel and carries inherent dangers. A forced boarding is considered dangerous and could escalate quickly, officials and analysts warn. The optics of U.S. forces boarding a vessel claiming Russian protection would be dramatic, with potential diplomatic fallout. This option appears to be on the table, but the decision rests with the White House. The risks must be weighed carefully against the benefits of enforcement. The U.S. could continue trailing the vessel indefinitely. This maintains pressure without forcing an immediate confrontation. However, it also allows the situation to remain unresolved, with the tanker potentially outlasting U.S. patience. The vessel requires fuel and supplies. Eventually, it may need to dock somewhere. U.S. forces could wait for that moment, or for the situation to change. But an indefinite pursuit is resource-intensive and may not be sustainable long-term. This option delays the decision but doesn't resolve the underlying dispute. Diplomacy could ultimately resolve this standoff. Despite public tensions, the U.S. and Russia maintain communication channels. A back-channel deal could involve Russia withdrawing its protection in exchange for some concession, or the U.S. accepting a face-saving resolution. However, given the broader U.S.-Russia tensions over Ukraine, such cooperation may be difficult to achieve. Neither side may want to appear to be backing down in public. The diplomatic path exists but faces significant obstacles. Finding a resolution that allows both sides to claim some form of victory will be challenging. The Bella 1 case illustrates broader challenges facing U.S. sanctions policy. Enforcing sanctions on the high seas is difficult, particularly against determined adversaries willing to use sophisticated evasion tactics. The Shadow Fleet has evolved sophisticated techniques to avoid detection and seizure. When major powers like Russia provide protection, enforcement becomes even more complicated. The U.S. faces a choice: accept the limitations of sanctions enforcement or escalate to direct confrontation. This dilemma will recur as long as sanctioned oil continues to flow through these networks. The blockade is part of Trump's broader Venezuela strategy. The administration believes that maximum economic pressure will force Maduro to negotiate or collapse. Seizing tankers and blocking oil exports are meant to demonstrate U.S. resolve. However, critics question whether the strategy will succeed, and noting that Maduro has survived years of sanctions and pressure. The Bella 1 standoff is a test of that strategy and its limitations. If a single tanker can escape seizure with Russian help, the blockade's effectiveness may be questioned. Maduro has proven remarkably resilient despite years of pressure. Despite years of U.S. sanctions, failed coup attempts, and economic collapse, he remains in power. His government has adapted, using the Shadow Fleet, Chinese buyers, and Russian support to maintain revenue. Whether the blockade can succeed where previous pressure failed remains to be seen. The standoff with the Bella 1 may be just one battle in a longer confrontation. The ultimate outcome will depend on factors beyond any single vessel. The international community is watching this standoff closely. How the U.S. handles this situation will signal its approach to sanctions enforcement globally. If Russia can successfully protect a vessel from U.S. seizure, other sanctioned states may adopt similar tactics. The precedent set here could affect sanctions enforcement worldwide, from Iran to North Korea to Russia itself. The stakes extend far beyond a single tanker in the Atlantic. This case could reshape how sanctions are enforced or evaded for years to come. A tanker named Bella 1 is at the center of a growing international confrontation. Reuters reports that the New York Times says Russia sent a formal request urging the U.S. to halt the chase. International reporting describes the tanker as Iran-linked and Venezuela-bound, though the full route can't be independently confirmed. U.S. officials and multiple outlets describe a pursuit that has lasted roughly 2 weeks. A U.S. official cited by major outlets says the crew appeared to paint a Russian flag on the hull. Reports say the ship later appeared in Russia's Maritime registry under a new name, Marinera. U.S. authorities say it lacked valid flag status when they attempted to board and that they hold a seizure warrant. Legal experts say the Russian registration may not provide solid protection, but Russia's diplomatic intervention raises the political stakes significantly. The standoff comes as Trump announced what he called a total and complete blockade targeting sanctioned tankers, and as he struggles to negotiate peace between Russia and Ukraine. A forced boarding could escalate tensions with Moscow. Backing down could undermine U.S. sanctions policy. Reuters and other reporting say the U.S. seized at least one tanker near Venezuela and later intercepted another. U.S. Southern Command says about 15,000 personnel are operating in the area. Venezuela calls the blockade piracy. Russia has reaffirmed its all-out support for Caracas. What happens next could set precedents for sanctions enforcement, U.S.-Russia relations, and the future of Venezuela's oil trade. The situation remains fluid. The stakes are high, and the world is watching.